Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. Today, we're going to be looking at the Gunn Brothers,
Okay.
Colin and David,
Right.
two notorious criminals who operated in Nottingham.
Yeah, their story captivated the entire UK, I think.
Right.
Not just because of the scale of their crimes, but also
Yeah.
because of the brutal way they treated anyone who dared cross them.
Let's start with the Bestwood estate.
Okay,
This place was basically their personal kingdom for over a decade.
that's right. The Gunns exerted control over the Bestwood estate using fear and violence,
Yeah.
but also, surprisingly, community support.
Really?
They were involved in drug trafficking, extortion, you name it.
Wow.
But there was a strange element of respect for them from some residents who saw them as twisted authority figures.
It's hard to believe people would support such criminals.
Well, they had a very effective method of eliminating competition in the drug trade.
Anyone who tried to operate outside their control faced severe consequences. We're talking brutal beatings, even shootings.
Really?
David Gunn himself recounted stories of people being shot in the ankles and wrists as a warning.
Gosh, that sends a clear message. It's hard to imagine the level of fear they instilled in the community.
Absolutely. They weren't just running a business. They were making sure everyone knew who was in charge.
Right.
They had a network of enforcers called the hyenas,
Okay.
often young skinheads who acted as their muscle.
So these hyenas were responsible for carrying out the Gunns' dirty work.
Exactly.
So we've got drug trafficking enforcers. What else do they do?
Armed robberies were also a regular part of their repertoire. The sources suggest they were involved in several, with Colin known as Knuckles because of his powerful fists leading the charge. There are stories about him knocking people unconscious with a single punch.
He sounds incredibly dangerous. It must have been difficult for the police to keep up with them. They were a constant headache for law enforcement.
Yeah.
The Gunns had a wide network of informants,
Okay.
including, shockingly, a corrupt police officer named Charles Fletcher who was feeding information to Colin,
Wow.
tipping them off about police operations.
That explains how they managed to stay ahead of the game for so long. But you mentioned community support earlier.
Yes.
Why would anyone stand by these criminals?
It's a complex situation. The Gunns engaged in a sort of twisted philanthropy.
Okay.
Strategically investing in their community, they'd give gifts to children, help families struggling financially, and generally kept other criminals away from Bestwood.
So it created a perverse sense of security.
Yeah, better the devil, kind of situation.
So they were playing both sides, the benevolent benefactor and the ruthless criminal. But surely nobody could condone the brutal acts they committed. The story about David Gunn biting off a man's eyelids and lips is horrifying.
That incident really underscores the level of brutality they were capable of. This wasn't just about intimidation, it was about inflicting pain and suffering to maintain control.
It's a disturbing reminder of the dark side of human nature.
Yeah.
Let's move on to what seems to be a turning point in their story.
Okay.
The shooting of Colin's nephew, Jamie.
That event set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to their downfall.
Okay.
Jamie was shot by a man named Michael O'Brien after a disagreement in a pub. He survived the shooting,
Okay.
but tragically died less than a year later from pneumonia, likely brought on by his subsequent alcohol and drug abuse.
So while not a direct murder, Colin still blamed O'Brien for his nephew's death.
Absolutely fueled by grief and rage.
Right.
Colin decided to take revenge on O'Brien's family,
Oh.
even though they had nothing to do with the shooting.
This brings us to the tragic case of John and Joan Sterland,
Yes.
Michael O'Brien's parents.
The Sterlands, an innocent retired couple, became collateral damage in this gang war.
Right.
Their son's actions sealed their fate, and Colin Gunn was determined to make them pay.
The events leading up to their murder are particularly disturbing.
After O'Brien was arrested for shooting, Colin Gunn began targeting his parents. Someone likely associated with the Gunns
Right.
fired shots into the Sterland's house while they were inside.
Oh my gosh.
They barely escaped by crawling on the floor
Wow.
and were understandably terrified. They went into police protection, but even that wasn't enough.
It sounds like they were desperate to escape Colin's reach. Where did they go?
They moved around trying to find a safe haven.
Okay.
They left police protection because it felt like being prisoners,
Right.
eventually settling in a quiet seaside village called Trusthorpe in Lincolnshire.
Okay.
They must have thought they were finally safe from the shadow of the Gunns.
It's heartbreaking that they thought they'd found peace only to be brutally murdered in their own home.
Two men dressed in boiler suits and caps arrived at their home in a black Volkswagen Passat. They broke in and shot Joan first and John, and it was a cold-blooded execution.
It's clear this wasn't a random act of violence. It was meticulously planned and executed. But how did the police finally catch up with Colin?
The Sterland's murder sparked a massive investigation called Operation Starburst involving the National Crime Squad.
Okay.
They were determined to dismantle the cartel and used every resource available.
Were they finally closing in on Colin?
Yes, but remember, Colin was still receiving information from the corrupt officer Charles Fletcher.
Right.
However, advances in technology, specifically mobile phone tracking, proved to be crucial in securing evidence.
So they were able to use his phone to track his movements to Lincolnshire on the day of the murders.
Exactly. Detectives placed him near Trusthorpe at the time of the killings.
Wow.
Phone records and other evidence directly linked him to the conspiracy.
So after years of running his criminal empire, Colin Gunn was finally going to face justice for his crimes.
It was a long time coming, but the net was closing in.
Right.
The trial was highly publicized, with Colin's notoriety preceding him.
I can only imagine the tension in the courtroom.
During the trial, Colin displayed his trademark arrogance, even insulting the jury and the judge. But despite his attempts to intimidate and disrupt the proceedings, the evidence was overwhelming.
And the verdict?
Guilty, Colin Gunn was found guilty of conspiracy to murder John and Joan Sterland and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years.
That's a significant sentence. What happened to his brother David?
Interestingly, David was acquitted of charges related to the Sterland's murders.
Right.
However, his involvement in the cartel's drug trafficking eventually caught up with him. And he served time for those offenses.
So with Colin behind bars and the police dismantling their network, what became of the Bestwood estate?
There was a sense of relief in the community, although cautious at first, crime rates dropped considerably and people slowly started to rebuild their lives. But the Gunn's reign left a lasting impact.
Their story serves as a reminder that justice can prevail.
Yes.
Even in the face of power and intimidation, though sometimes it comes at a high cost.
It's a potent reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of revenge. But there's more to uncover in this story.
Yes, there are many other fascinating aspects to this case, including the impact of their crimes on the community and the efforts to dismantle their entire network.
Indeed, and we'll delve into those details in Part 2 of our exploration of the Gunn Brothers and their criminal enterprise. Stay tuned.
Okay.
Yeah, it's remarkable how this case illustrates the different aspects of power and influence.
Yeah, it takes a mix of skills to build and maintain a criminal empire like theirs.
Right? On one hand, you had Colin, the imposing figure, always ready to resort to violence.
Right, and on the other you had David, who was considered the brains behind the operation.
Yes, he was more strategic, more calculated in his approach.
But the sources also mentioned that David has expressed regret for his actions since then.
That's right. In a recent podcast, he even advised young people to avoid a life of crime.
It makes you wonder if it's genuine remorse or just regret for getting caught and losing everything, including millions of pounds seized by authorities.
It's hard to say for sure, but it does show how even those deeply involved in such activities can have a change in perspective.
Yeah, it's a glimmer of hope in this otherwise grim tale, though we can't forget the devastating impact of their actions on the community and the innocent lives lost.
Oh, absolutely.
Like Marvin Bradshaw, who was killed in a shooting intended for Jamie Gunn.
Absolutely. The ripple effects of their crimes are still felt today.
And their downfall didn't erase the underlying social and economic issues that contributed to their rise in the first place.
That's an important point. The Bestwood estate was facing challenges like high unemployment and poverty, creating a breeding ground for crime.
And the Gunns exploited those vulnerabilities, offering a warped sense of stability and opportunity that some found appealing.
It's a classic example of how organized crime can flourish in communities where legitimate opportunities are scarce.
But this case isn't just about the Gunns. Our sources highlight other key figures in Nottingham's criminal underworld.
Yes, we can't ignore the taxman. He's described as a shadowy millionaire who controlled the financial side of the drug trade in the East Midlands.
Wow, they don't even reveal his real name in the sources, which speaks volumes about his power and influence.
He operated behind the scenes pulling strings, but rarely getting his hands dirty.
Right.
Lending money to dealers at extortionate rates, laundering their profits through legitimate businesses, and even resolving disputes between rival gangs.
He sounds like he was operating on another level entirely.
His story illustrates the interconnectedness business of organized crime, corrupt officials, and seemingly legitimate businesses, criminal networks can extend far beyond the streets.
Then there were the Dawes brothers, John and Rob, who ran their own multi-million-pound drug empire from a small house in Sutton in Ashfield.
They were a major force importing huge quantities of drugs from Spain, Holland, and Belgium.
Their operation was so large that they even started burying their drug stashes in coded locations to manage the surplus.
That's right, it was a sophisticated operation.
But eventually they too faced justice, right?
Yes. Operation Normality, launched by Nottinghamshire police with support from the National Crime Squad, eventually caught up with them.
So even these seemingly untouchable figures couldn't escape the law.
Not entirely. While John Dawes and several associates were convicted and received long prison sentences, his brother Rob managed to escape.
Oh, did they ever catch him?
He was eventually apprehended in Dubai and is now awaiting extradition to face charges related to a massive cocaine seizure.
So the story continues.
It seems these criminal networks are like hydras. You cut off one head and another one appears.
We can't forget the impact of these individuals on Nottingham's reputation.
During the peak of the Gunn's reign, Nottingham was often called Shottingham because of the high levels of gun violence.
Oh, gosh.
Shootings, assassinations, and a general sense of fear gripped the city.
It must have been incredibly challenging for the police to operate in that environment.
They faced intimidation, threats, and even attempts to infiltrate their ranks. It took years of investigation, building trust with the community, and utilizing new technologies to finally weaken the grip of these criminal organizations.
It's encouraging that the sources mention a significant decrease in gun violence and crime in Nottingham after the Gunn's downfall.
Yes, it seems the city was able to breathe a collective sigh of relief.
But the story doesn't end there, does it? We still have the unsolved murder of Marion Bates and the ongoing search for James Brodie.
That's right. Brodie, a small-time player in the Gunn's network, is believed to have fired the fatal shot that killed Marion Bates during a botched robbery in 2003.
And he's been on the run ever since.
That's right, for over 2 decades.
Wow.
Despite numerous attempts to locate him, including a recent search of a farm in Lincolnshire where he was suspected of hiding, Brodie remains elusive.
It's incredible that he's managed to evade capture for so long.
It highlights the challenges law enforcement faces in tracking down fugitives, even with modern technology.
It's unsettling to think that someone responsible for such a brutal crime is still out there, potentially living a new life under a new identity.
It's a thought that haunts investigators and the victims' families.
But shifting focus back to Colin Gunn, he's still in prison, isn't he?
Yes, he's currently in HMP Long Lartin, a high-security prison.
Is he still trying to run his empire from behind bars?
Not quite, but he's certainly not passively accepting his fate. He recently launched a legal challenge over his escape risk classification.
What was that about?
He argued that his classification was preventing him from being moved to a lower security category, claiming his human rights were being violated.
So even after orchestrating the murder of an innocent couple, he's still trying to manipulate the system.
It seems his desire for control hasn't diminished.
This case is full of twists and turns.
And there's still more to uncover.
Stay tuned for Part 3 of our Crime Time, Inc. investigation, where we'll reveal even more shocking details about this gripping saga.
His legal challenge regarding his escape risk classification was successful.
Wow. So even as a convicted murderer with a history of violence, he was able to use the legal system to his advantage.
Yeah, back in 2014, he was moved from a high-security unit within HMP Belmarsh to a standard wing.
It raises serious questions about the balance between security and individual rights in the prison system.
Absolutely, and it shows that Colin Gunn is a persistent individual who never gives up, even when the odds are stacked against him.
Yeah, this case also reveals some serious concerns about police corruption, particularly with the involvement of Charles Fletcher.
Yeah, Fletcher's actions were a major breach of trust.
Right. His betrayal had a devastating impact, not only allowing the Gunns to evade capture for years, but also eroding public trust in the police.
It led to a major internal investigation and a complete overhaul of their vetting procedures.
So the Gunns' reign of terror didn't just affect the community, it shook the foundations of law enforcement in Nottingham.
It forced the police to confront some uncomfortable truths about their own vulnerabilities and take steps to address them.
The sources mentioned that after the Gunns' downfall, Nottingham police implemented new initiatives to combat organized crime and rebuild trust with the community.
Yes. Operation Reacher was launched, involving targeted raids, increased surveillance, and a strong emphasis on community engagement.
So it seems they were determined to learn from their mistakes and make positive changes.
And it appears to have been effective. Crime rates in areas like Bestwood have significantly decreased.
It's encouraging to see that some good came out of such a dark period.
Yeah, while the Gunn's legacy is one of violence and fear, it also served as a catalyst for positive change within the police force and the community.
But we can't wrap up this discussion without addressing the unsolved murder of Marion Bates and the continued search for James Brody.
It remains a frustratingly open chapter in this story.
Yeah, despite numerous efforts to locate him, Brody has vanished without a trace.
His ability to evade capture for over 2 decades is a testament to his resourcefulness and the challenges of tracking down fugitives, even with today's technology.
It's unsettling to think he could be out there living a new life while the victim's family still seeks justice.
It's a thought that haunts investigators and the victims' families.
Charlie Fletcher, a police officer sworn to uphold the law, operating in this crazy environment. He's supposed to be the good guy, protecting people from guys like the Gunns. But instead, he ends up working for them, leaking sensitive information, shielding them from investigations. It's just mind-boggling. What would make a police officer betray his oath like that? Was it greed? Was he intimidated? Or did the Gunns find some vulnerability they could exploit? These are the questions that make this whole case so fascinating. In the end, his corruption was exposed, and he got a 7-year prison sentence. But here's where the real mystery starts. Our sources have practically zero information about what happened to Fletcher after he got out of prison. It's almost like he vanished on purpose. Was he afraid of what his former associates might do to him? Did he try to rebuild his life under a new identity, forever haunted by his past? The lack of information just makes it even more intriguing. You'd think a corrupt cop, linked to a cartel as notorious as the Bestwood cartel, would leave some kind of trace, even just rumors. But there's nothing official.
It's strange, and that silence is pretty telling, don't you think?
It is.
It speaks to the power of fear, and it makes you wonder if Fletcher was deliberately erased from the story. Maybe for his own protection, or to protect others who were still involved.
So where do we go from here? How do we unravel this mystery when there's nothing official to go on?
Well, I think we have to get a little creative here. You remember that shadowy figure we talked about, the tax man?
Yeah.
The guy who supposedly controlled all the finances of the Nottingham underworld? He might be a lead.
Oh, interesting.
He's described as a millionaire, legitimate business interests, but also connections to former police officers.
So someone like Fletcher could disappear pretty easily with his help.
Exactly. If Fletcher needed protection or a way to launder his money, the tax man would be the guy to go to.
It's all starting to connect now. How deep did this corruption go? What was it like for the undercover cop who had to walk into that?
Risky, for sure.
Risky is an understatement, I think.
Yeah.
This is the Bestwood cartel we're talking about, led by the Gunn Brothers. They weren't just criminals. I mean, they were practically running the show in Bestwood.
Right. They weren't just some gang hiding in the shadows. They were out in the open, almost like a strange kind of authority.
Yeah, like a twisted version of, like, community leaders or something.
Exactly. And they backed it up with, violence. Anyone stepped out of line, there were consequences. David Gunn talks about it himself in one of these interviews.
Oh, yeah, the punishments. It's brutal.
Joyriding, broken legs, stealing, smashed hands, that kind of thing. No messing around.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it? That kind of environment. I mean, it's terrifying, obviously, but there's almost a sense of like a twisted order to it.
Yeah, that's the thing about the Gunns. They instilled fear, but some people, they saw it as control. They thought, hey, at least things are getting done,
It's disturbing, but yeah, I can kind of see how that would happen. And that's the world that Neil Woods, our undercover officer, walked into to infiltrate a group like that.
Guts. Takes a lot of guts. Everyone was terrified of the Gunns.
Absolutely. I mean, just reading about it, it's clear this was a high-stakes operation.
Yeah.
And, Woods had to be smart about it. Couldn't just waltz in.
Right. He started small. Befriended this low-level drug user, a dealer. Slowly built trust.
It must have been a slow burn.
Oh, yeah. He had to play it carefully. Little gifts here and there, made-up stories, the whole 9 yards. Just to get close to the inner circle.
So much pressure, every interaction, a potential slip-up.
Right, and they tested him constantly. There's this one story, really chilling. The cartel's lieutenant, he holds a knife to Wood's groin just to see if he's for real.
Oh, man. Talk about a test of nerve.
Yeah. That really sums up what Woods was up against. Constant threat, never knowing if you'd make it out. But he had a mission.
Survive, gather intel, bring them down.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even crazier. What Woods found wasn't just a powerful gang. It was corruption inside the police force itself.
Yeah, that's what really blew my mind going through these sources. This wasn't just some isolated bad apple situation. It was systemic.
You said it. Colin Gunn, he had a mole right inside the Nottinghamshire police. PC Charlie Fletcher.
Talk about betrayal.
And he was paid well for it. £2,000 a month just to leak information to the Gunns?
It's insane.
Right.
Not just raids and investigations.
Yeah.
We're talking witness intimidation. Undercover operations compromised. The whole system was at risk.
Exactly. This wasn't just bending the rules a bit. This was full-blown corruption. And it had consequences. Real devastating consequences, like what happened to John and Joan Sterland. I think the biggest lesson is that corruption has a ripple effect. It starts small, maybe someone looking the other way, but it spreads. And before you know it, innocent people are getting hurt.
Yeah. Like the Sterlands, like Marion Bates. Their stories really highlight the human cost of all this.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that we can't be complacent. We have to hold people accountable, speak out against wrongdoing, and fight for a system that's truly just.
We can't just assume it'll all work out. We have to be active, engaged.
Right. We have to demand better from our institutions, from our leaders, and from ourselves.
We've seen what happens when we don't. Bestwood's a stark reminder of that. But it's also a reminder that there's hope.
Hope.
Yeah, people like Neil Woods. He risked his life to expose the truth, to bring the cartel down.
Yeah.
That takes incredible courage.
Oh, absolutely. He's a true hero. And his story shows us that even in the face of darkness, there are people willing to fight for what's right.
And that's something worth remembering. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the darkness, by the corruption, by the violence. But there are always people fighting back, people trying to make a difference.
Yeah. And those stories deserve to be told. We need those stories. They remind us that change is possible, that justice can prevail.
Well, it seems like we've just about reached the end of our time for today.
Yeah.
This has been a truly fascinating case full of twists and turns and shocking revelations.
It really highlights the complexities of organized crime, the far-reaching consequences of violence, and the importance of justice.
Absolutely. It's a story that reminds us of the human capacity for both good and evil, and the challenges faced by law enforcement in combating these criminal enterprises.
And the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity.
Yes. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the dark world of the Gunn brothers.
It's been a pleasure.
Two very experienced ex-police officers will discuss this case in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.